Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Chanel, and I'm from rural Montana. And when I say rural, I mean rural quite literally. I was raised as a single child in a remote utopian, unspoilt part of the world. I grew up in the early 80s in a very pastoral, rustic-style country home surrounded by the exquisite countryside that consisted of mountainous valleys, statuesque rugged outcrops, open prairies, silvery streams, and vast areas of natural wood green that was primarily made up of ponderosa pines and Douglas firs, many that were so magnificent and some over at least 100 foot tall. I adored the wood green and all the horse-riding trails that smelt so refreshing with the nostalgic, sweet, uplifting scent of pine that was so reminiscent of Christmas to me. Our snug home was unremarkable, as it was a standard symmetrical home with 2 stories and whitewashed walls, with a green slate roof, sizable bay windows and green shutters, but it served our immediate purposes. It was comfortable and cosy, with generous-sized open fireplaces and parquet wooden flooring throughout, with a magnificent sweeping staircase that led up to the 2nd floor. Yet, despite the simplicity of our home, it really did look as pretty as a picture, as the sprawling verdant countryside served to elevate its physical aesthetic appeal, as it would be exceedingly difficult for anything to look ugly amidst such mesmerizing, resplendent beauty. We possessed a couple of red barns on our land for storage purposes and a sizable stable block that could house 8 horses that always smelt of leather and hay. We were the fortunate owners of 2 very friendly American quarter horses called Laura Ashley and Lavender Sky, a rambunctious, mischievous Scottish terrier called Scotty, who was completely devoted to my mother and followed her everywhere, and a very intelligent, sprightly and friendly pot-belly pig that we called Leftover. He put on weight at a rapid pace because my mother would give him all our scraps, which was marvellous because we didn't have to have a garbage disposal, as Leftover did a sensational job in gobbling up everything that we didn't want. I had a particularly good relationship with Leftover because at dinner time the pig would hide outside the dining room window in high expectation of a tasty morsel, and he knew that he needed to remain very still and quiet or his cover would be blown, and Leftover would do virtually anything for food, so you could train him very easily. My mother would never ever let me have dessert until I'd eaten every last morsel on my plate. She was very strict about that. So the moment her back was turned, I would open the window, while my father would sneakily keep her preoccupied, while I would throw out all the food and give it to Leftover, who would be absolutely delighted to receive it. My mother was a nutritionist, and dinner was never that tasty, because quite frankly, there is a limit to how exciting a vegan nut loaf is going to be, to a staunch carnivore that likes meats and potatoes, much like the likes of my father and myself. Thankfully, my mother was none the wiser about our clever little arrangement. My father and I often went to the local diner for dinner to avoid some of my mother's meals and to enjoy a nice juicy succulent steak together, and he often brought me a secret stash of snacks which I hid at the bottom of my dresser, and this went on for many years without my mother ever finding out about it. Growing up, we lived quite far away from the local town, and there was an uneven granular road we called the Long Lonely Road that was known for being rugged, stony and precipitous. In truth, you did not want to get stuck on that craggy road because help was unlikely to come your way, and more than likely you would probably have to walk back home all on your own. In those days we didn't have cell phones, yet even today people have been trapped on that road and unable to get cell phone reception because the connections are atrocious. Suffice to say that dusty road is still poorly maintained and was always referred to as the Long Lonely Road, and at best you might spot a lone fox crossing your path, or even a few elk or a black bear. But a human passing by in a car is less likely to be seen, as the road is used rather sparingly by the residents in the area, who possibly take a trip to the local town only once a week at the most to stock up on supplies, even though my family was more inclined to use it regularly. My story that ultimately led to my Bigfoot encounter happened in the early fall of 1982, when I was a young 16-year-old girl at the time. One weekend, my parents received a phone call from my uncle saying that my aunt had been taken seriously ill with some mysterious illness that the doctors were simply unable to diagnose, and things were looking seriously grave for her because she was going downhill very fast, and my mother, who was close to her sister, asked me if I didn't mind manning the fort while they were away. "I need to see my sister," she told me with tears in her eyes. "She's always been so healthy, bless her soul. But your father and I ought to spend some time with her over the next couple of days. I'll be taking Scotty with us, as there's nothing like a dog to help a sick person get better, and you know how much your aunt adores little Scotty. You don't mind being on your own, do you, dear?" "I'll be fine," I assured my mother. "Don't you worry about me. I'll look after the horses and leftover, and I'll also take care of absolutely everything." "Good girl," said my mother, planting a kiss on my forehead. "I knew I could depend on you." Did I mind? Of course not. It would be great fun to be on my own. And so when my parents had left, I surreptitiously called my boyfriend Duncan to tell him the great news and to ask him to come and stay with me so we could have the whole house to ourselves. For when the cat's away, the mice do play, let's not kid. I remember how disappointed he sounded on the phone when he promptly informed me that he was going away with his family for the weekend on a camping trip, which was a real bummer. My heart sank, as I was so hoping we could spend the weekend together. I then phoned my best girlfriend Pansy, but she was also busy over the weekend, so I was well and truly stuck on my own. It was 4:30 in the afternoon, and I had fed the horses and also left over our pot-belly pig, who was now bursting at the seams from all the healthy food my mother had left me in the fridge for me to consume. I was making myself a hot cup of cocoa when I suddenly realised that our cookie jar was completely empty. I was really feeling like a delicious chocolate chip cookie, and all that was left was a scattering of crumbs at the bottom of the tin. Damn, I thought. I felt like some chocolate, and the urge was so strong for me that I could not stop thinking about it. No wonder they say that sugar addiction is equivalent to cocaine, because I just knew I needed to get to town to stock up on cookies fast. Over the years I've learnt to drive quite well, as my father had taught me how to drive when I was as young as 11. But I confess I didn't have a driving licence, but my mother's car was parked in the bay, and what she didn't know would never hurt her. I promptly found some spare cash and my mother's car keys, and I climbed into the driver's seat and off I went. It made me feel remarkably grown up, leaving our premises in the car and driving through our cattle gate to make the 45-minute trip to the local town. I had a growing list in my head of what I would be buying that got progressively larger and larger as I approached the town. I fancied some chocolate chip cookies. That would be nice. And how about some fresh doughnuts and some salted barbecue chips? The list began to grow again. Then I began to salivate, as I thought all about the delicious chocolate I would eventually be enjoying. It was very rough driving on that long, lonely, precipitous country road. and my mother's bright red Ford Mustang wasn't easy to manoeuvre at all. It jolted and wobbled as random stones began beating against the car's underbelly. It was certainly a precarious journey, to say the least, but I didn't care about any of that, for at the end of my journey lay a colourful, enticing rainbow with a delectable chocolate chip cookie at the end of it, and what could be better than that? I managed to get to the small town and surreptitiously parked my car in a very discreet place under a large oak tree, as I didn't want to be observed by any of the town locals, as I was well acquainted with most of the people here. Imagine my extreme annoyance when, whilst in the store, I just happened to bump into Miss Ivor Miller, who could be a nightmare at the very best of times, and was without doubt the quintessential town busybody. Just my luck. Why, of all the people that I had to bump into, it had to be Ivor Miller. She was the first person I would have sooner avoided. Ivor Miller was a well-rounded, stout woman in her early 60s, with short curly hazelnut hair and brown beady eyes that always gave you the distinct impression that she had X-ray vision, because you felt like she missed nothing and was studying you as intently as an eagle that scans its prey. "Hello, Chanel," she said, regarding my less-than-healthy basket with a fervent interest and intrigue. It was obviously overflowing with chocolates and snacks, and everything we're always told never to eat. I could tell Ivor looked quite thrilled to have quite literally caught me with my pants down, in a manner of speaking, as buying crap, especially as my mother's daughter, did not look good for her resume as a highly acclaimed dietitian with a formidable reputation behind her, and she was always quick to boast about the healthy food she claimed her family enjoyed, and was simply clueless about how much of it actually ended up in the stomach of our pot-bellied pig. Her guiltless shopping trolley was a quintessential example of cutting-edge whole-food living at its finest, and was always filled with impressive packages of lentils, beans, vegetables and brown bread, whilst mine was overloaded with all this sinful but delectable stuff that, if my mother were to witness, would quite literally make her squirm with horror. "You look like you're about to have a lovely feast," she said. "I must admit I've never seen your family buy anything unhealthy before. Of course, with your mother's illustrious reputation as a dietitian." "Well, I just felt like a little chocolate," I said, guiltily flushing red with embarrassment. "Where is your mother?" she asked. "I don't see her around anywhere." "Oh, she's back at the car," I lied. "Poor thing, she's got a terrible migraine headache." "A migraine headache?" piped Ivor. "You shouldn't be buying chocolate for migraines. Do you know it's the worst thing for your mother to be eating? But I think she should know that, being a dietitian, of course." "The chocolates aren't for her," I said. "They're for me." "I see," said Ivor. "Your secret's safe with me, but you better not eat it all at once, or you'll be very sick." "Should I go and have a word with your mother?" she said. "It could cheer her up to see me." "Absolutely not, Ivor," I told her. "When Mum has migraines, she doesn't want to see anyone. She's very, very self-conscious, especially without her makeup on, and her hair's messed up. And besides, she's still only wearing her pyjamas." "Like I worry about all that," said Ivor. "I'm not that shallow, you know. I don't care what she looks like. I think I'll go and have a word with her. It'll do her good to have some adult company. And I can quiz her about what's really going on with all those naughty chocolates you're buying." "No," I said, raising my voice. "You can't do that, Ivor. My mother doesn't want to see you. I'm sorry, but she doesn't want to see anyone." "Oh, dear," said Ivor. "Very well, if you put it like that. Oh, by the way, do tell your mother that Mrs. Jenkins has lost her horse American Pie. You know the one. She was about to ride her, but she bolted off as something spooked her very badly. She could be anywhere now, so do keep an eye open for her. I'm helping her put signs all over the town, offering a reward for anyone who can find the horse." "I'll tell her," I said hurriedly, making my way quickly back to my mother's car, glancing over my shoulders to check that I wasn't being stalked by Ivor. Damn that woman, I thought. That was close. What if she asks my mother about her erroneous migraine headaches, when my mother doesn't even get migraines? What then? If my mother were to ever find out that I'd been driving her car without a licence, I would be in heaps of trouble. I pushed those thoughts to the back of my mind, as I did not want to concern myself with those issues. Well, not now, anyway. I got back into the Ford Mustang, and before long I was travelling down the long, lonely road, and then quite suddenly my car just stopped. I tried to start up the engine, and then I groaned. Oh, no! What an idiot, I thought. My mother's car has completely run out of gas, and I was literally miles away from the town, and also miles away from my home. I was in the middle of nowhere, and it was a guarantee that no car would be driving down this road any time soon, hence its formidable reputation as the long, lonely road. It wasn't called that for nothing. I slammed my head on the steering wheel and let out a few annoyed screams, and I banged my hand on the horn, blowing it a few times in my heightened level of frustration. Oh, no! What an idiot I was! How stupid did I have to be not to observe the gas gauge flashing away? There was no choice to the matter. I'd have to walk home, and it would be a long, drawn-out, arduous trek, but I was short of any options. I either stayed here for well over 48 hours or possibly more, or I made the trek home, and it wasn't a difficult decision for me to have to make. I quickly opened my mother's trunk and retrieved the spare anorak and a torch, and then gathered one of my shopping bags with chips and biscuits and proceeded to walk the long distance home. I decided to turn down one of the horse trails that led through the wooded area, as it was a shortcut, but I was secretly cursing that I wasn't wearing better shoes. There was a great deal of treefall, and the ground was thickly covered in leaves and twigs, and after trekking for what seemed like an age, darkness eventually descended over the whole valley, and there was a distinct chill in the air, and I began to shiver, so I swiftly put on my mother's anorak. Even though I could see clearly, I was frequently stumbling over rocks, and on one occasion I took a fall and slid over a sandy patch, and inadvertently managed to twist my ankle. Luckily no real harm was done. Yes, it hurt slightly, but it wasn't too bad. But I did feel as if I was walking forever, and that there would be no end in sight. When would I ever get home, I wondered? This whole thing was an absolute nightmare, and my longing for a chocolate chip cookie had long since subsided, as all my focus was to get home in one piece, without being mauled by a wild animal, because cougars and bears were very common in these parts. It was a glorious night, although I failed to see its beauty, as I was so overcome with a heightened anxiety. I truly did not like being alone in the darkness, and it was getting cold, but the vast firmament that stretched above me, filled with a myriad of tiny silvery glittering stars, made me feel very inconspicuous, vulnerable and small, much like a tiny little ant. How I wished with all my heart that I wasn't on my own. I could hear the chirping crickets and the croaking frogs and the distant howls of coyotes and wolves. All of a sudden I also discerned the sound of heavy footfall that seemed to be stalking me, and my heart suddenly began to thunder through my chest, and I could feel chills of terror prickling down my spine. I knew better than to run, for no one should ever run from a predator, but I still speeded up my walk, and noted that the feet behind me also increased their pace. When I stopped, so did they, and when I moved forwards, the feet began to move too. I could sense that I was definitely being followed, and it was by an apex predator. I'm not sure how I knew this, but I just did. It was without doubt a powerful, pretentious presence that was following me, but what it was, I could not imagine. But it sounded like this being was walking on 2 feet, and not 4, but I was sure that I had to be mistaken about that. I kept warily glancing cautiously over my shoulders, so nervously, trying to see if I could discern an animal stealthily shadowing me, but nothing was ever there. "Hello," I shouted. "Is anybody there?" But I was met with an inauspicious sound of silence. "Hello? Hello? Is anybody around?" Again, silence. All of a sudden something began to throw pebbles at me, and I turned around, and then moving towards me was a large critter on 2 feet. I was so dumbfounded and speechless by what I was seeing, because this creature was so unorthodox and idiosyncratic. Indeed, it was so outlandish and peculiar that I was literally too startled to even react. As strange as it sounds, I was so overcome with such astonishment that I think my fear dissipated, although clearly I should have been terribly afraid, given this creature's gargantuan proportions. But looking back, I believe my angst was suppressed by the sheer enigma of seeing something so out of alignment and so incongruous with everything I thought I knew. I had never heard of a creature like this ever existing in North America before. This experience quite literally turned my view of the natural world completely upside down, to such an extent that I am open to believing almost anything is possible, and am far less cynical than I ever used to be. At a conservative estimate, I would say the creature was approximately about 9 foot tall. It was covered in long, flowing, dark hair, but what colour it was I couldn't directly discern, because it was too dark for that. It possessed very overlong arms that travelled below the knees, and his sturdy, agile legs were significantly shorter to its arms by contrast, although they were strong and powerful. I'd recently seen a documentary on gorillas, and the creature with its broad-barreled chest, powerful shoulders, not to mention its pyramid-shaped head, rather reminded me of those mountain gorillas in the programme I had watched. But at the same time, this creature was significantly different. It had an incredibly human shape to its face that rather reminded me of a ruggedly handsome man, while its deep-set dark eyes seemed very intelligent and kind. The creature had a sweet musky smell that rather reminded me of the sweat after a workout, but it wasn't offensive in any way. I stood there like a complete lemon, staring at the creature in horror, not knowing how to react. I was somewhat perplexed and befuddled, as this creature kept indicating for me to follow him, using signals not unsimilar to a human's. I can assure you I had absolutely no intention of following him, so I quickly turned around and proceeded to walk away, doing my level best to ignore the creature, but he was not going to put up with my complete disregard of him, and promptly threw a scattering of pebbles at me to get my attention again. I quickly turned around, and he again began indicating for me to follow him. He pointed and then made the perfect imitation of a horse that was whinnying. I was astonished, as why was this creature making a horse noise? He made the noise again and again, and kept pointing. I don't know why, but something compelled me to follow him, and that was when I saw Mrs. Jenkins' horse, whom I knew very well. It was American Pie, and she was standing behind a large thorny briar, and was fully saddled and eating the grass with her reins and bridle still intact. She looked up when she saw me, and trotted over to me so happily, and was as delighted to see me as I was indeed to see her. I put my arms lovingly around her and stroked her mane. I knew I could ride her back home, so things were really looking up, and the relief I felt was completely overwhelming. I could not abide walking for so many miles at a time, surrounded by darkness, and being afraid of all the dark, looming shadows between the trees, and the unsettling feeling that eyes were watching me. I nodded at the creature to say thanks for leading me to American Pie, and promptly ran towards him and handed him my plastic bag full of goodies that I no longer cared about any more. It was the least I could do to say thank you. The creature grabbed the bag with the enthusiasm of a monkey. He was so excited that he behaved like a kid at Christmas, opening his Christmas stocking. Indeed, he was so thrilled that he began to chatter away frenziedly, and fanned out all my shopping over the ground to examine it very carefully. He sniffed each individual packet curiously, and then selected one to open. It was the chocolate chip cookies, and he scattered them everywhere, and began to eat them. And I could see by the joyous expression on his face that he really enjoyed the taste of those delicious cookies, and who could blame him, for they were very good. I mounted American Pie and began to trot down the hiking trail that I knew exceedingly well, and on his back I felt safe and secure, despite being in the dark with the cold wind blowing against my face. I began to enjoy my ride. I waved at the creature while he nodded at me, his mouth now crammed full of cookies. After trotting for a while, I was amazed to see the creature running beside me, and in his hands he held out an eagle's feather towards me, which at the time I thought was exceedingly odd, but now I realize he was gifting me. I watched him, armed with my shopping bag in his hands, glide past us with the speed and grace of a cheetah, and he was gone from our sight in the opposite direction towards the mountains. I noted that American Pie wasn't at all unsettled by the creature. Finally I arrived at home, and I was never more pleased to be back to the place where I felt reassured and invulnerable. I placed American Pie in our stable blocks next to my other 2 horses and put a horse blanket over her body and fed her with oats, molasses, maize and vegetables, along with some chopped up apple and carrot, and she was one very happy horse. When I returned to the house, I promptly phoned Mrs. Jenkins to tell her that I'd found her horse and that she could collect her in the morning, and I could tell that she was in tears over the phone, as her relief was immense. The next morning Mrs. Jenkins arrived at my house at the crack of dawn with her husband in her jeep, with the horse trailer. I'd always liked her, as she was an easy-going, fun-loving woman who wore her heart on her sleeve. On this particular occasion she was wearing her blue riding jodhpurs, a white shirt, a tweed jacket, along with her riding hat and boots. I'll never forget how she ran over to her beloved horse with tears pouring down her face, and she began stroking her and burying her face in her neck. "You have no idea what this means to me, finding my best horse in the world," she said, handing me a large wad of cash for my trouble. "I don't want your money," I said, "but there is something you can do for me, with no questions asked, and that is my condition." "You name it," said Mrs. Jenkins, "and I will do it for you, with no questions asked," she said teasingly. "My mother's red Mustang is parked in the long, lonely road, and it needs petrol. Could you fill it with petrol and drive it back here and park it back in our drive before my mother gets back home?" I handed her over the keys. "If you do this, you'll be getting me out of a whole heap of trouble." "Oh, I see," said Mrs. Jenkins, laughing. "Consider it done, dear," she said, tapping her nose as if to say, "This is our little secret." To cut a long story short, Mrs. Jenkins was true to her words, and my mother's car was firmly parked in the bay, no worse for wear, and when my mother returned home, nothing looked at all out of place. It would seem that my aunt's health had radically improved, and she was well on her way to making a swift recovery, although the doctors were still unable to make a diagnosis on her mysterious, strange illness. A week or so later my mother bumped into Miss Ivor Miller in the local store, and Miss Miller looked at my mother's trolley stocked with healthy food and grinned at her like a Cheshire cat. "It must be tough keeping up appearances, Jenny. But you're not fooling anyone," she giggled. "I know you have a sneaky little chocolate addiction, and I understand, believe me, I do, but I do think it's a bit hypocritical, if you don't mind me saying so, telling all your clients to never indulge in anything naughty, when surreptitiously behind closed doors you are clearly tucking into all kinds of naughty stuff yourself when nobody is looking. And worse still, you're getting your daughter to buy you the stuff, so no one will be any the wiser. But I'm on to you, Jenny, and you're not such a saint after all." "I don't know what you're talking about," my mother had said. "Do you think I bought all that baloney your daughter told me the other day? Well, it was last Saturday, I think, about you having a migraine headache. Of course I didn't. I'm not so naive. I know she was buying those chocolates for you." "Sorry, I don't know what on earth you're talking about," said my mother. "I wasn't here last weekend. I was taking care of my sick sister." "Well, I saw you myself," said Ivor. "You were hiding in your red Mustang that was parked under the oak tree. So lie to me all you like, Jenny, but I know what you were up to." "You must be mistaken," my mother had said, shaking her head. "I definitely wasn't here. You must be confusing me with someone else." Ivor laughed. "You're good, Jenny, but you don't fool me one bit." When my mother returned home, she asked me if I knew what Ivor was talking about. "No," I said, furrowing my forehead, looking very puzzled. "I mean, you were away, Mum, on Saturday. You were looking after your own sister. If you ask me, Ivor must have her wires crossed." "My thoughts exactly," said my mother. "Maybe the woman is finally losing her marbles." So there you are. That's my story about being stuck on the long, lonely road and encountering an anomalous creature I now know all these years later fits the perfect description and profile of a Bigfoot. Whether he was actually reaching out to help me or American Pie, I don't know. Maybe he was helping the both of us, but I'm grateful for his help, because I ended up getting home sooner, and I got away with joyriding in my mother's car, without her ever learning about what I got up to. Sadly for my mother, thanks to Ivor Miller, there were whisperings and mumblings around town that my mother had a secret chocolate addiction, but it made her more human in the eyes of all her clients. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Hugh, and I'm from Western Canada, which is a prepossessing area around British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and it's part of the world known for its exquisite Rocky Mountains and its famous ski resorts, and of course turquoise lakes, namely Lake Louise, which bedazzles and beguiles hundreds of tourists that visit our part of the world every single year. I was raised in Alberta, which in my unbiased opinion is the most beautiful province in Canada, which is home to the Moraine Lake and Banff National Park. I grew up in the early 80s in a double-storey home surrounded by exquisite mountainous views, undulating verdant countryside, flowery prairies, and exquisite silvery lakes. My immediate family consisted of my older brother Warren and both my beloved parents. Growing up, my parents were very private, contained people who did not rarely converse with outsiders, so our immediate circle of friends was very small and condensed. However, as a young boy, my brother and I made copious amounts of good friends through school and Boy Scouts, but my parents always encouraged us to spend time at their homes rather than inviting them back to our place, which was on my part a real bummer. I think the problem arose from my mother's deep-seated insecurities and self-consciousness. She was a very elegant, stylish and petite woman with shoulder-length dark auburn hair, pale skin and blue eyes, and she was incredibly attractive, so much so that half the boys in my school had a huge crush on her. "Is that your mother?" they would say when she came to pick us up from school, and they would eye her with wide eyes and say, "She's ever so pretty." I do not know why my mother was so sequestered, self-effacing and eremitical, and I can assure you, all these years later, I still know only scant, vague, rather indeterminate nebulous details about my mother's childhood, which is still deeply cloaked and clouded in a mystery that I would rather not unearth, for fear of what I might uncover. So I'd rather let sleeping dogs lie. I never met my grandparents on her side, so I'm rather inclined to believe that she must have encountered some trauma growing up that caused her to become such a reclusive, withdrawn introvert, who hated any form of social interaction, and sometimes appeared unintentionally rude and standoffish to strangers due to her desperate need to escape any kind of social interaction. I do recall that social events like sports days, school plays and parents' evenings at our school were only ever attended by my father, as my mother chose to remain isolated and solitary, sheltering herself from attending any event that would potentially overwhelm and oppress her. She was like a tortoise who would shrink back in her shell when she felt very unsafe. I assure you she did have a full and happy life and adored us as her children, but she was never comfortable around crowds of people. The only thing I do know about my mother is that she did run away from home hundreds of times as a young girl, and that she had a father who was always getting drunk and was a very volatile, explosive and belligerent man, so I think it would be safe to assume that her childhood was not a happy one and that she did suffer a measure of abuse. I do recall on numerous occasions my friends would say that their parents thought my mother was a snob who looked down at everybody and seemed to have the superiority complex, but nothing could be further from the truth. My mother did have one very close friend, a lady called Cynthia, who was like a sister that she never had, and Cynthia and her were as thick as thieves, and I believe she knew more about my mother than anybody else in the world did, and that includes my father. I do remember Cynthia telling me once, "Your mother is so misunderstood by everyone. She's like such a gentle doe with the biggest, most beautiful heart that is so fragile, sometimes frightened and timid, but so glorious and precious." And I knew she was right, because my mother was indeed a magnificent soul, and just because she did not conform to natural stereotypes of what many would consider to be normal, did not make her of any less value. My story that ultimately led to my incredulous, rather extraordinary Bigfoot encounter happened when I was about 12 years old, and we lived in the mountains, so we often asked our parents if we could camp out of doors, and they were always consenting and agreeable to these arrangements. My father would give me his rifle for protection, as we lived in bear country, and there were other predators that loitered around, such as mountain lions, coyotes, wolves and bobcats, so we needed to be ever wary of these creatures, but in most cases these animals were probably more apprehensive about us than we were about them. "I like it very much indeed when you get close to nature," my father would say. "Nothing is richer or better for the soul than to breathe in the fresh mountain air and to fend for yourself in the wild, embracing all manner of weather conditions and all kinds of exciting challenges that will set you well up for your manhood." From when we were 10 years old, we had learned how to hunt and fish, which were savvy, proficient skills we procured, thanks to my father, who was a very competent hunter himself. As boys, many a summer night was spent camping under the stars and making a fire pit for ourselves where we cooked the fish we had caught in the lake over an open grill, and nothing was more delicious than the flaky taste of that buttery fish that melted in our mouths. My brother and I always fancied ourselves as intrepid adventurers, and we simply adored exploring the woodgreen, as it was an enchanting, magical and whimsical world within a world, and almost a meditational hangout or sanctuary, if you like, where we could ponder over our thoughts, and it brought us so much peace. My father always used to say that trees are like nature's natural healers, because their energy balances and grounds us, and I am absolutely certain he's right. This woodgreen was utterly magnificent, and the word breathtaking comes to mind when I begin to describe it to you. It was an idyllic haven for indigenous wildlife, from elk to mule deer, squirrels, chipmunks, raccoons, wolves, foxes, and the list goes on. Yet there was something oddly peculiar and enigmatic about these stumps that my brother and I could never ever fathom. They appeared to be covered in very intentional decorative displays, where lean, thin timber sticks were aligned over each other with meticulous precision, almost as if someone were paying them homage and honouring them, much like we remember our dead with a headstone in a graveyard. My brother and I noticed these strange displays throughout our lifetimes in the woodgreen, along with branches where bark had been purposely removed off every few trees, which seemed to mark a trail of some sort. But who or what was actually doing this, we could never understand. All these years later, I am convinced that these are the works of a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, or even a Yeti if you like. We used to hitch our tents on the granular beach that overlooked the mesmerising silvery lake that was fringed by the masterful statuesque backdrops of the mountains, which were scantily scattered with a few clusters of spruce, logpole pines and red maples on the lowest elevation. The rear of our tents was of course heavily flanked by the woodgreen that we explored so much. One pleasant day in the late summer of 1983, after my brother and I had pitched our tent for the night and prepared our fire pit, while spending a relaxing and rewarding afternoon fishing by the lake, we successfully caught several medium-sized trout, which we grilled over the fire pit and ate hungrily, and they were very delicious. We then sat back on our camp chairs and gazed up at the kaleidoscope of the silvery stars and the full ivory moon that enveloped the dusky sky in an ethereal luminescence. The dusky shadows danced under the moon, accentuating the resplendence of the lake and its gentle waves of water that rippled delicately, whilst it reflected the mountains, trees, and even the stars on its shimmering surface. We could hear the sounds of chirping crickets and croaking frogs, interspersed with the distant howls of a wolf or a coyote. "Oh boy, it's such a beautiful night tonight," I said to my brother. "I'm so glad we live here in Alberta. I don't think I'd want to live anywhere else in the world." "I know exactly what you mean," said my brother. "I also couldn't imagine living anywhere else." Before we dived into our sleeping bags to turn in for the night, I decided to quickly go and relieve myself and venture into the woodgreen that was behind our tent. I walked on the leaf litter and crunched the debris beneath my feet, and I was pretty certain I'd heard a rustle in the leaves behind me, and I grinned to myself. I knew it was my brother creeping up behind me with great stealth in order to play a trick on me, and in the process scare me half to death. It was so typical of him to do this. I was now on to his little game, and had him cornered, and I was rather pleased with myself, feeling ever so smug, and I was about to turn his little trick back in on him and give him the scare he was unlikely to ever forget. I could hear him rustling around and discern a branch moving, and so I pounced on him unexpectedly to surprise him, but it was not my brother, it was a bear. I am sure the creature mistook my antics as an act of aggression on my part, and looked very aggrieved to see me. My heart was pounding violently in my chest, and I tried to remember everything I'd learnt about bears. What was it? Play dead with a grizzly? Fight for your life with a black bear? In truth, when confronting a bear in the wild, sometimes everything you ever thought you learnt, and all those words of wisdom, just go flying out of the window, as you tend to follow your gut instincts instead, and fight for your life, which is exactly what I did. I could not tell what this bear was, because it was so dark, but it was huge and powerful, and its dark, shadowy silhouette was very intimidating. It bolted towards me unhesitantly, resisting any attempt to mock charge me, raising itself up on its hind legs. It began to beat me violently with its sizable, large paws, and it bit me viciously with its teeth all over my body. I did not feel any pain, but I fought back by kicking the bear and oscillating my arms wildly, and trying to punch him as I was driven by a powerful adrenaline surge which increased my strength and stamina. It would seem that my fear and anxiety had been placed on the back burner, as my primary focus was to stay alive and to fight with all my strength, might, and every last bit of energy left within me. But I was no match for this sizable creature. I felt like a tiny mouse in the presence of a domestic tabby, and you know it's on rare occasions that the mouse manages to outrun the cat. I knew things were looking bleak for me, and I was certain I was dead, but I kept fighting back, feeling water pouring down my head, blinding my eyes and trickling into my mouth, and I could taste the metallic, salty taste of my own blood. The last thing I remember was being lashed across the head so violently that everything became foggy and hazy, and I must have passed out, because I don't remember anything after that. Looking back, I think that my state of unconsciousness had literally convinced the bear that I was finally dead, and was, in fact, my saving grace. I remember waking up feeling completely disorientated, confused, and befuddled. Where was I wondered? I realised suddenly that I was buried in the depths of the ground, in what can only be described as a large open pit, beneath layers of branches that were crossed over me, and I realised I was in some kind of a nest, and quickly discerned and smelt the disgusting and rotting carcass of a deer being eaten alive by maggots, lying yards away from me, and I could hear those maggots eating the flesh. I could smell pine and see a few bones scattered liberally among the acorns, and low brush leaves from blueberry and raspberry bushes. I remember my head was throbbing violently. There wasn't a part of my body that was not aching or on fire. I kept slipping in and out of consciousness, and there were times when I could hear what I thought were the frantic screams and calls of my mother and father calling out my name. "Hugh! Hugh! Where are you? Hugh! Hugh! Hugh!" The voices kept calling. They were obviously searching for me, but I didn't answer, for my lips could barely move. They were dry, parched, and crusty, and my throat was full of clotted blood, while my fatigued body was exceedingly weak, and I felt as if I was fading away. I didn't care any more. I felt almost as if I'd been pulverized in a mincer, and the shooting pain that seared through my body was so incredibly dreadful that quite frankly I was happy to surrender to my impending death with an ease and acceptance of note. I just wished with all my heart that I would slip away easily and effortlessly, because I didn't have any strength or fight left in me. How long I was buried in this nest I cannot tell you, and whether this renowned omnivore was intending to eat me or not, I didn't even know. On one poignant occasion I thought that the bear had returned, after he had believed I'd been marinated in my own body fluids and had been transformed into a succulent, tender and juicy steak for him. I could hear his hefty, sizable form rummaging through the nest, as if searching for me. I could discern that the dead deer being eaten alive by maggots had been thrown out of the nest and promptly disregarded, while some of the maggots had been flung over me and were now crawling and wiggling all over my skin and sucking on my dried blood hungrily. I could hear and feel pine branches being lifted off my body and flung out of the nest. I was too numb to be afraid, for all emotions and energy were so drained and depleted from me, like the water from a sink, and I was willingly resigned to my imminent plight. I could sense the odious bear examining my body with its head only inches away from my face, and I surreptitiously opened my eyes, one after the other, and found myself looking into the concerned, deep-set dark eyes of an exceedingly human face that I realized later possessed a body shape and form equally as big as a bear, but covered with long flowing human-like hair. This creature looked astonished and confounded to see me, as the expression in his eyes was dumbfounded, almost as if he couldn't believe what he was perceiving. The creature used his sausage-sized fingers to wipe away the dirt and blood from my face to get a better view of me. I remember he was smelling me intently, while his expression remained bewildered, and his grunts sounded rather like he was saying, "What the heck is this?" I could feel him rest a very small part of his pyramid-shaped head, which must have been his ear, on my chest, as if he was trying to establish whether I had a heartbeat at all. I think he realized I was alive, because the very next thing I knew was that he lifted me up very gently in his overlong arms like a fragile china doll that he was absolutely terrified of breaking, and he ran with me like the wind in his arms, with such a gentle grace, never bumping my body once, as I assure you any sudden jolts would quite literally have detonated the landmines of my nervous system to explode into sparks of shooting pain throughout my body. I do not think I've ever been carried so gently in my entire life, and I never will be again. And this creature glided through the wood-green, past the silvery lake, through the flowery meadow, towards my parents' home, and then on reaching our home he let out several high-pitched whistles. My mother, on hearing the strange whistle, glanced out of the upstairs window, only to see a huge shadowy form standing beneath the window, staring up at her with a red eye-shine, and carrying in his arms a bundle that she discerned had to be me. She told me later that she sensed my energy, and she felt no fear towards the outlandish creature, hurriedly raced down the stairs and came running out towards me, and I could hear her frantic sobs. The creature looked directly at my mother, with very sorrowful eyes, for I am sure he thought I was dying, and he placed me gently on the ground, and then glided away into the woods, and that was the last thing that I remember. I woke up to find myself in a private hospital room, after having received an extensive operation for a shattered femur, while my body was badly bruised, and I had bites around my neck and upper chest, and my head wounds had caused me a great deal of bad concussion. I was informed by the doctor that I was exceedingly lucky to be alive, and had a narrow escape, and it was a miracle that I hadn't actually been killed, because I had taken a very serious thrashing. I was to learn from my brother that after I went to relieve myself that night, before we retired to our sleeping bags, my brother had promptly fallen asleep almost straight away, blissfully unaware of my absence. He had awoken the following morning to find me gone, and had quickly run home to tell my parents that I was missing. He felt exceedingly bad that I had succumbed to a bear attack, only yards away from where we were sleeping, while he remained blindly oblivious to the perilous danger that I had found myself in. "You know how private Mother is," said my brother. "She refused to tell anyone what happened to you. Not even the police were informed that you were missing. Mum and Dad did not stop searching for you day or night, and Mother was a complete mess. She thought you were dead. We had no idea what had happened to you. They did, of course, hire a tracker to try and find you, and he was unable to locate your body. He told us that you had clearly been attacked by a bear, as he found a very evident trail of bear prints close to where we camped, large bear scat, and one of your shoes lying on the ground, simply covered and drenched in your blood, along with ominous-looking drag marks. He said that he could see signs of a scuffle and droplets of your blood on random ferns, but not enough blood to affirm that you were dead. I think, of course, he did discover a bear nest, and he saw a deer carcass covered in maggots, but he did not see you in the nest, nor did he find the whereabouts of the bear that attacked you, as he intended to kill it." "Well, if he had actually moved the branches of the nest, he would have found me then," I piped. "I was under them." "Maybe not," said my brother. You might have been invisible to him, even if he had looked at you directly. Do you have any idea how filthy you looked? You were as dirty as the ground, and your blood had turned a brown colour. Mother thinks it would have been almost impossible to see you, which was why she really regrets not hiring a tracker with a dog, because a dog would have smelt you, that's for sure. Do you realise that you were gone for 3 days and 2 nights? So long, I said. I had absolutely no idea. Of course you didn't, because half the time you were probably unconscious. But you have some maggots on you that cleaned up your wounds very nicely. The doctors were impressed by how clean your wounds were, because they could have gone septic, especially on the areas where you were bitten by the bear. Lovely, I said. That's what I really like to hear. How are you, sweetheart? Said my mother, gently pushing my brother out of the way and grabbing my hand and looking down at me on my hospital bed with doting, gentle, adoring eyes. I've been better, I said. Don't do that to me ever again. You hear me, son? You scared the living daylights out of me when I thought we'd lost you for good. You know what you boys are to me. You're both my world. I don't have many close to my heart, so you're my everything. I love the bones off the both of you. I know, Mum, I said. I'm so sorry. Don't you go apologising for anything, nor being sorry, said my mother sternly. None of this was your fault. I'm just so grateful to that creature for saving your life, because he rescued you from that bear nest. If it weren't for him, you would almost certainly have died. I must admit he was a kind-looking soul, but what he was, I couldn't fathom. I can only describe him as a huge angel sent by God himself, covered with hair, built like a giant, with the face of a human being, but a very, very kind face. And so it was after months of arduous, laborious rehabilitation and physiotherapy, once when I'd fully recovered and life had returned to normal again, my brother and I were up to our usual old tricks. And one day in the wood green we were examining the strange arrangements of sticks on a stump of a large tree, where these anomalous designs were a source of great fascination and intrigue for us. Do you suppose they may be done by the creature that actually rescued me? I said. More than likely, said my brother. I mean, let's face it, whatever that creature was, he was definitely almost human. And it has to be something very intelligent that did this, because you can see that every single branch has been arranged intentionally and purposely in a very specific pattern. It's got to mean something. What do you think it means? I asked my brother. Well, maybe they value every tree, those creatures I mean, because they live in the forest, and the pattern is almost like a remembrance of the tree that once stood here, almost as if honouring it in some way. The creatures probably love trees, just like Dad does. All of a sudden I got the very distinct feeling that something was watching us. I think something's watching us, I whispered, feeling a chill running down my spine. I feel it too, said Warren, looking at me. Shh! I think I hear something. As you can imagine, I was particularly anxious, as after my bear attack, I was suffering from a degree of post-traumatic stress, and any strange sounds or feelings rattled my nerves. I looked around me very nervously, and then I could hear a crunching of twigs and leaves, and that was when I saw a dark silhouette peering at us from behind a tree curiously, and then it moved itself away from the tree and stood only yards away from me and began to whoop with delight. This huge creature that towered at 7 foot tall and was 700 pounds and 3 feet across the shoulders looked at me with an expression of astonishment upon his face, and he kept pointing at me with his overlong arms and continued to whoop with delight. It was as if he was saying, "It's a miracle! You're alive! I can't believe it! I thought you were a goner!" That was what his body language conveyed to me. This quirky, eccentric, rather comical-looking creature, with bright, cheerful dark eyes that twinkled with humour, was, I sensed, by nature as elusive and reticent as my mother is. But on this occasion he forgot his shyness for a moment, as it was seemingly suppressed and overshadowed by the joy he clearly felt to see me alive, for I could sense and feel his jubilance. He pointed at me and then to himself, and then to the direction of our home, and I realised at once that this was the creature who had rescued me, and he was explaining that he had saved my life. I began to point at him and smile, and I nodded my head. I said, "That's right. I remember you. You saved my life. Thank you so very much. I know this might sound very strange, but even my brother sensed that the creature knew exactly what I was saying and appreciated my words. He bounded up towards us, patted us enthusiastically on the back with his hand, let out a couple of happy whoops, and then glided away into the woods, whistling away happily. My brother and I grinned at each other. "What a lovely fellow," I said, and he agreed. "He's one of a kind, that's for sure," he said. It took 25 years for us to establish that the anomalous creature we encountered was known as Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or Yeti. Every year on the anniversary of my accident, my mother would leave out a box of goodies for him in the wood green. We would leave a huge selection of fruit, nuts, cookies, dried fruits, crisps, and jerky for the critter, and in return on our doorstep we would always find unusual shaped twigs, which I now believe were gifts. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Fraser, and I was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest in the 70s, where I grew up in the countryside in a large classical double-storey traditional farmhouse. You know the kind, with a symmetrical shape, whitewashed walls, large windows with blue shutters, and a matching front door, with a recent added addition of a modern wraparound porch, which overlooked the idyllic resplendent views over the ravishing countryside. I was raised in this cosy, comfortable, snug dwelling with my younger sister Anna and both of my parents. Our cosy, snug abode fully embodied our easygoing, carefree lifestyle, for there were large fireplaces, wood-burning stoves, bookshelves that were almost choking at the seams from hundreds of books, large Persian rugs, and the most comfortable settees scattered liberally throughout our home that was so inviting that you would commonly find a cat or two curled up fast asleep on one of the cushions, whiling away the long summer afternoons in a state of euphoric bliss, heightened further by the prisms of sunlight that danced through the windows, enveloping the settee in a delicious warmth which every cat fully appreciates. Our house was nestled in the heart of the valley like a pearly white jewel, and was surrounded by acres of undulating verdant green countryside, statuesque mountains, and ubiquitous areas of Douglas fir, hemlocks, and cedar trees that stretched out into acres of mountainous forest, which was a natural haven for all the indigenous wildlife. My mother made natural soaps for a living, scented with all kinds of fragrant essential oils, my most favourite being neroli, lemongrass, bergamot, and lemon. All her soaps were distributed to select shops over North America and were in high demand, whilst my father was an excellent skilled tracker, marksman and hunter who offered courses for people who wanted to perfect their shooting techniques in target practice and so forth. My story that ultimately indirectly led to a remarkable Bigfoot encounter that impacted my family so dynamically that it literally transformed the entire course of our lives in ways we never envisaged possible, and happened in the early autumn of 1972. It all began one night when I was awoken to the ominous rumbling sounds of thunder, and I quickly climbed out of my cosy bed and scurried to close the open window, as a brisk northerly wind was blowing vigorously through my bedroom with an icy cold freshness which enveloped my room in the fresh scent of pine. My curtains were thrashing violently against the walls. I shivered with cold and briefly glanced out of the window and could see bright flashes of yellow lightning exploding across the sky like jagged vertical fireworks. All of a sudden the clouds burst open and the pitter-patter of rain increased in intensity, until it bucketed down forcefully, and it was raining cats and dogs, while the thunder boomed and crashed noisily, and I could hear the gurgling sound of water rushing out of the drain pipes with a fervent intensity. This was quite some storm. I sat up nervously in bed, with my hands grasped over my knees, and my terrified cat Munchkin dived under my duvet cover, burying herself beneath the sheets, while the lightning flashes lit up my bedroom for a moment like the flash from a camera, and then soon dissipated, to be followed by another discomposing crash of thunder that once again caused me to clutch my pearls. I felt slightly anxious, as booming storms could rattle my nerves. I promptly put the duvet cover over my head and cuddled up to Munchkin, who was trembling while her hair was standing on edge and her tail puffed up to double its size. "It's all right," I said, stroking her long fur tenderly, trying to reassure her. "The storm will soon pass." But my cat was not remotely calmed or comforted by this unsettling storm, and her round, frantic, saucer-like eyes revealed her terror. All of a sudden we heard these loud, crashing, portentous, inauspicious knocks that were so terrifying it sounded like the Grim Reaper was pounding at our door. 1, rap. 2, rap. 3, rap. It was a menacing, baleful sound that was infinitely more acrimonious and threatening than the thunder itself. I truly had deplorable, graphic, grotesque visions in my head of a foreboding pirate with a black bandana on his head and a black eye patch over his left eye, standing there in our doorway with a menacing, toothless grin and a jagged metal hook for his hand, waiting to wreak vengeance over our entire household. The very thought sent shivers down my spine and left a bitter, nasty taste on my tongue. I could hear this violent, sinister rapping sound 3 more times, thrashing against our door, and I was overcome with terror, and my flighty heart was pounding at 100 miles an hour. "Who the heck is that?" I could hear my father saying, getting out of his bed and putting on his striped gown and slippers. "And on a night like this, too." "I'm not sure you should answer it," piped my mother. "The way they're knocking has set my nerves on edge. Supposing it's the axe murderer." "Ha, ha, ha. You have a heightened imagination, love," my father said. "It's possibly someone with car trouble, stuck out on a country road, caught up in the storm. I can hardly turn my back on someone who needs our help, can I?" "Even so," said my mother, please be very careful. You do tend to be very trusting. Please watch your back." I heard muffled voices at the front door, and I reached for my dressing gown and immediately tiptoed down the staircase, as I was exceedingly curious as to what on earth was going on. I could hear the low drawl of male voices talking in serious, urgent tones that certainly got my attention aroused. I watched my father lead a mysterious, troubled-looking stranger into the living room, whilst he stoked up the fire and removed the man's drenched raincoat, placing it on the hook in the hall. He called out to my mother, "Sweetheart, please could you make some sweet hot chocolate for our guest? He's had a little bit of a fright." "Coming up," came my mother's voice, and I watched her run down the stairs, past me, stopping halfway down the stairs for a moment to tell me to go back to bed. "What are you doing up, Fraser?" she scolded. "Back to bed now." Taking no notice of my mother's futile commands, I crept down to the doorway and looked between the open crack, watching my father as he was still stoking up the flames of the fire and adding more wood to reactivate it, and the lazy flames began to intensify, and before long the fire was crackling away very happily in the hearth. "It's only autumn," he said to the man, "and it's so chilly out there. We're already having fires at night. I think it's going to be a very cold winter this year." "Well, it certainly doesn't help being caught out in that dreadful storm," said the man, who appeared to still be trembling. "I really hope you don't mind my intrusion." "Of course not," said my father. "What happened out there?" he asked. "Well, my wife and I were driving down the country road," said the man, "and it began to pour, and my wife Matilda saw a beautiful white poodle mix, completely drenched by the rain, looking miserable and terrified by the storm, and it was cowering under a tree in terror. My wife told me to stop the car, which of course I did, and then she got out of it and began to run towards the little dog, and the poor little mite got really scared and began to run away from my wife. I watched her running after it, and then she bolted under a tree, and in a trice the whole tree just lit up like a bright cocoon of light, and was struck by lightning, and all of a sudden my wife was flung off her feet onto the ground, and everything happened so quickly. It truly was like watching a horror movie unfold before my very eyes. It was quite dreadful. Quite dreadful." "You are kidding," said my father, growing as white as a sheet. "You mean your wife was struck by lightning? Where is she now?" he asked. "She's not dead by any chance?" "I'm not sure, that's the problem. I don't know what happened to her," said the man. "It was exceedingly odd. All I know is the lightning hit the tree and my wife was flung over violently. And then I saw this monstrously huge creature that was covered in hair, with a human-like face, picking her up and running off with her in his arms. I quickly got out of my car and tried to run after him. He was gone from my sight. I mean, he moved so fast. I've got no idea what I should do. I managed to get the little dog into my car, and the poor thing is still there, terrified out of its life, and is cowering and recoiling under the seats." My mother, who'd been standing in the doorway, handed the man his hot cup of steaming chocolate, which he took from her hands very gratefully, although I could tell he was still shaking like a leaf, and appeared very troubled and distraught, which in the circumstances was exceedingly understandable. "You mustn't worry," she reassured the man. "You've come to the right house. My husband's a tracker, and so if anyone can find your wife, he's the man for the job. But I think you should wait until the weather settles down. It's not safe out there. It's quite some storm, and you don't want to be caught up in it. Have you got your car keys?" she asked. "I'd like to bring that little dog inside, if I may, that's stuck in your car. The poor thing must be so terrified. I'd like to dry him and give him something to eat, if you don't mind, of course." "My keys are in my raincoat," said the man, "hanging there on the hook in your entrance hall, and my car is parked in your driveway under the awning of your carport." "What shall I do?" asked the man, looking at my father with a befuddled expression on his face. "Should I call the police? I'm not sure what course of action to take in a scenario like this, when my wife appears to have been snatched by an outlandish creature." "Absolutely not," said my father. "You don't call the police in a delicate situation like this. They could potentially mess up the trail of evidence that would ultimately lead to your wife. We cannot afford to let that happen. They're not trained to see things in the way that I can see them. You heard my wife. I am a qualified tracker, and I prefer to work on my own without any intervention. Tell me more about this wild animal you saw." "Well, it's not really an animal," said the man. "It was more like a man, but covered in hair and built like a giant. I think he could have easily been 9 foot tall and 3 feet wide across the shoulder area. I know it sounds incongruous and outlandish and even unbelievable, but I'm not making any of this up." "I believe you," said my father. "This isn't the first time I've heard of the wild man before, and according to the legends of the indigenous people, they're usually very elusive, benevolent beings, but there are, of course, exceptions to the rule, as is always the case." "What do you suppose he wants with my wife?" asked the man. "Why did he run away with her?" "I'm not sure," said my father. "The wild man could have been rescuing your wife, or he could have abducted her. There are stories from bygone days of wild men abducting women and children. Then there's another thing to consider, and that is the condition of your wife, because being struck by lightning can cause all manner of physical complications, like cardiac arrest and brain injuries or nervous conditions, not to mention serious burns, and it is potentially deadly. We must hope for the best and prepare for the worst. The only thing I can recommend now is to pray." The man drained his mug of chocolate and stared vacantly into space. "This is all so surreal," he said. "I feel as if I'm trapped in the middle of a horrendous nightmare, of which there seems no escape. I keep pinching myself to assure myself that I'm not actually dreaming." "I think you should stay at our home for a night or so," said my father, "as long as it takes until I find your wife. As soon as the storm lifts in the morning, I'll start tracking her down for you right away. But you need to get some good sleep," he said, ushering the man into one of our spare rooms that was always made up and ready and waiting for an unexpected guest. "But," stammered the man, "I need to find my wife." "Not in a storm like this, you don't," said my father. I could hear my mother in the kitchen blow-drying the little dog and talking to it gently. "Who's a pretty boy?" I heard her say. "I think I'm going to call you Cloudy, because you were found when the clouds burst. If you haven't got a home, you can live with us." I peeked into the kitchen and saw my mother fussing over the cutest dog that I've ever seen, and it seemed so affectionate and happy to be in the safety of our home. And by the doting expression in its eyes, it looked as if it had taken a huge shine to my mother, which wasn't surprising, as my mother had a natural way with animals. The following morning, and when I say morning it was closer to lunchtime, but it was breakfast for us, as everybody had overslept, with of course the exception of my father, who'd been searching for Matilda since the morning had broken. I knew in my heart that if that woman was to be rescued, that my father was more likely to find her than anyone else. He had earned a formidable reputation as a tracker, and he never usually returned empty-handed, so my expectations for a positive outcome were exceedingly high. My mother was bustling around in the kitchen with an apron around her middle and fussing over our interesting new guest, who I discovered was called Lucas Blossom. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in his hands, looking through the local paper, trying to distract himself from worrying about his wife Matilda. Cloudy, the little white mixed poodle dog, was tucking hungrily into some chopped pork sausage and fried egg that my mother had cooked him, and was waving his tail happily and moving the little plate all over the kitchen floor, trying to lick up all the egg yolk. If you had not known any better, you would have thought that Cloudy was our dog, for he seemed to settle into our home just with effortless ease. My mother presented our guest with a cooked breakfast, or brunch if you like, of bacon, egg, sausage, French toast and fried tomatoes, and an apple Danish pastry. "You must eat," she insisted, "to keep your strength up." All of a sudden the kitchen door burst open abruptly, and my father was standing there with a pale-faced woman whose face was smeared with so much mud that her blue eyes almost pounced out at you from the earthy mask. She looked somewhat confused, befuddled and bewildered, and her hazel-brown hair hung around her face limply in ragtails, and her clothes looked crumpled, creased, muddy and untidy. Not to put too fine a point on it, she looked a little like a drowned kitten that had been dragged through a hedge backwards. She was certainly a sight for sore eyes. "Matilda!" gasped the man, running towards his wife, his face transformed into a picture of rapturous joy. "You're alive! I can't believe it! I thought I'd lost you forever! I thought you were dead!" The poor woman seemed overwhelmed and looked at her husband rather blankly, almost as if she didn't recognise him for a moment, and it was clear that she was discombobulated and benumbed. "Everyone, please calm down," said my father, "and compose yourselves, please. Matilda here has had a very nasty shock, but no real harm has been done. Although after the lightning strike she did lose consciousness for a while, and she's still very confused. I did take her to see the doctor at the hospital, and he has examined her thoroughly and given her a clean bill of health, and everything is fine. All her tests came back normal, and the only thing that seems to have burnt her is her shoes and her feet, that have unfortunately got quite burnt, but otherwise she's fine. The doctor is, however, confused as to the trajectory of the lightning strike, as she appears to have no burns anywhere else on her body, with exception to her feet, but she will tell you everything in due course, after she's had a long soak in a bubble bath and something warm to eat. In the meantime, I'm sure she would appreciate some space, and she might even need a little sleep, because she's very, very exhausted. It's not every day you get struck by lightning. The doctor has prescribed plenty of rest." My mother serenaded the woman to the bathroom and ran her a lovely hot bath, and left her some PJs to wear, along with a soft, fluffy bathrobe. While the woman was bathing upstairs, my father had grabbed himself a hot cup of coffee, and then he told us his side of this remarkable story. "It wasn't easy tracking Matilda down, as the rain had washed any sign of discernible footprints away. I had no idea where she had gone. I had to put myself in the wild man's shoes and envisage what I would do to make my escape in a storm. You see, sometimes when you're a tracker, you need to use your sixth sense or your intuition. I looked around me on the road and could see a tree that had been struck by lightning, and it was dying. It had been hit very badly and took one hell of a beating. A short distance from the tree is the wood green, flanked by some rugged outcrops, which I have heard from many locals is home to a few cave-like structures, and that to me was the most obvious, logical place where a wild man would take cover from a storm, if indeed there are some caves in that mountain, which I assume there probably is. As you can imagine, the ground was exceedingly wet from the storm, but everything felt fresh. There were several branches from trees that had broken off during the night, as there was quite a wind. I have been even informed while listening to the radio, when I was driving around, that many roads in our area are now blocked by trees, so there's been a lot of tree fall in the area. He continued, as I ventured towards the rocky outcrop, I began to call for Matilda, as I knew if the wild man had intended to help her, that he would want to return her safely to her people, and that my calls would alert him to my presence. All of a sudden I heard a loud rustling sound, and then a few pine cones were flung in an easterly direction, as a distraction. But I purposely took the bait, as I wisely discerned that this was an intentional ruse, which is why I purposely obliged by walking towards those cones, as the wild men are elusive by nature and don't want to be seen or observed by humans. I didn't want to behave in a way that could break the seamless flow of the rescue operation. I glanced briefly over my shoulders just for a second, and that was when I saw a dark, shadowy form stealthily moving behind me, and he was carrying Matilda in his overlong arms, cautiously placing her on the ground. And then he glided away, and once out of my field of vision, he let out a high, piercing whistle, purposely designed to get my attention. And so I turned around to see Matilda, who was sitting on the ground, staring into space vacantly, and I carried her back to the car and rushed her off to hospital, where she went through a series of tests, all which thankfully came back normal. So she's one lucky lady who's had a hell of a shock, but we can celebrate the very fact that no long-lasting damage appears to be done. The doctor informed me that many people after a lightning strike suffer from long-term repercussions like headaches, hearing loss, debilitating pain, which are unlikely to have happened to Matilda, but she could present with some post-traumatic stress, and we need to be aware of that. "Did you see what the wild man looked like?" my mother asked. "I intentionally chose to play the game according to his rules. I didn't want to unsettle the critter," said my father. "So no, I didn't see him clearly. But I did discern his very large shadowy silhouette, as I told you. That was very sizable indeed." If we were hoping to learn from Matilda what had actually happened to her, I can assure you that that did not happen for over 2 long days, because the woman slept solidly in the confines of a private room where my mother kept a beady eye on her. But I'm glad to tell you that on the 3rd day she woke up to join the rest of the family for breakfast, and she was so hungry that she bolted her food down and even asked my mother for seconds, which was a very good sign. And finally she told us her incredulous story, which in the 1970s left us completely dumbfounded and in wondrous awe. "Are you sure you're ready to tell us what happened, Matilda? Because if you're not feeling up to it, we will understand," said my mother reassuringly. Matilda gripped her mug of tea tightly in her fingers, so tightly in fact that I could actually see the white of her knuckles, as all eyes around the breakfast table were firmly fixed very solemnly on her, and even my normally chatty and very lively sister Anna never said a word. Indeed, you could have heard a pin drop, as everything became so quiet in that kitchen, which was a first. "No," said Matilda with a determined voice. "I truly need to talk about it, to make sense of what happened. In a strange way, it seemed so dreamlike, in my mind's eye, that it's almost as if it happened to somebody else and not to me. What I do remember, however, is Lucas and I had just been to the theatre, and we were discussing the play we'd just seen. And then Lucas took the wrong turning, which is why we ended up driving down this quaint country road, with elevated embankments of tall trees. I vividly recall it was bucketing down with rain, and I discerned a little white dog soaked to the skin, looking utterly petrified and hiding under a tree for cover. The poor little thing looked so vulnerable, lost and afraid. I asked my husband to stop the car so that I could rescue the poor bedraggled little mite. I climbed out of the car, and within seconds my clothes were hanging on me in wet, limp rags, as the downpour was extensive. I ran towards the dog, my shoes squeaking and squelching with the water. The little dog recoiled in terror on seeing me and darted away, while I continued to run after him. The next thing I knew is the tree I was standing adjacent to at the time just lit up in a bubble of light, and a side flash of this light almost hopscotched over to my shoes. The next thing I knew was I felt this excruciating pain in my feet, almost like I'd placed them directly in a live socket of electricity, and it packed such a powerful punch that was so forceful that it flung me off my feet, and it was like I felt as if my feet were on fire, and then I must have slipped into unconsciousness and passed out. I awoke to find myself in a dry cave, and I was covered in piles of pelts, and my clothes had been removed from my body, including my shoes, that later on I would discover looked like they'd been melted. I looked up to see 4 pairs of red eyes staring down at me from different heights, with tall, dark, shadowy forms that I couldn't see clearly because it was so dark. I remember something being put in my mouth that tasted very sweet with the texture of glycerine, and I swallowed it and then went back to sleep. I was so confused I was not really certain whether I was dreaming all this or not, as everything felt so surreal and illusory, as if I was watching myself from outside my body in a movie of some kind. I remember even feeling very sorry for the little form wrapped up in deer pelts, which clearly was myself, of course, so maybe I was even out of my body for a while, who knows, but if that was the case, I wasn't consciously aware of it. I awoke again when light was streaming through the cave, and that was when I saw the 4 figures clearly, and they were staring down at me with deep-set dark eyes that were so kind and caring. I felt enveloped in what I can only describe as an unconditional, profound and bodacious love, like the love of God. These creatures were very big, powerful, lofty, majestic, and exceedingly intimidating. But I ask you, how can you feel fear when you just sense the real compassion and empathy that these creatures exuded towards me, unlike anything I've ever experienced before, and I'm likely to ever experience again? The largest creature was male, and I believe he was my rescuer. He was over 9 foot tall, 800 pounds, and 3 feet wide across the shoulder area. He possessed a gargantuan-sized barrel chest and very sinewy, lanky body that was shredded and muscular like a very elite athlete. He looked so human it was uncanny, as his body shape and face were like ours, only titanic in size, and he was covered in long flowing dark hair with attractive auburn highlights, which was scant under the arm and around the knees on all the creatures. The creatures all had large pyramid-shaped heads that blended and folded seamlessly into the shoulders, and I did not perceive any neck to speak of. They also possessed very long arms that hung below the knee area, with human-like hands with tufts of hair up to the knuckle. There was a mother, father, a female little one, and a little male. The 2 younglings were about 3 feet tall and looked to be of a similar age, and so my guess is they were non-identical twins. The larger male, whom had rescued me, had the most beautiful eyes I have ever seen, and was so gentle and angelic. I will never ever be able to forget those eyes for as long as I live. They were completely mesmerizing. They spoke to each other all in very defined words that sounded like a fast chattering African language, because there were a lot of deep clicks that I could hear in the enunciation, and they talked to each other excitedly, backwards and forwards all the time, and I perceived that they were discussing me. The female handed me back my clothes that by some miracle had been dried, and I displayed no signs of being burnt except on my feet, of course. They watched me in my naked state getting dressed. I'm normally a very shy, reticent person and exceedingly self-conscious, especially about my body. But dressing in front of these creatures was not remotely embarrassing for me, possibly because they're just such natural creatures that a naked body to them is as normal as the grass or a tree. The female gave me what looked like this resin on a bark to drink, which tasted sweet, and the aches I felt in my body subsided immediately. All of a sudden I could hear the voice of a man calling my name. The creatures looked at each other and appeared to sound pleased, and the female pointed at me. The male creature unhesitantly lifted me up in his arms so gently, and jumped from a high elevation with me in his arms, without jolting my body once, and landing on his feet with the agility and bounce reflex of a cat. And then he glided down the rugged outcrop with the ease of a mountain goat and the speed of a cheetah. I could see the female standing on the side of the rock, throwing pine cones in an easterly direction, while the large male put me down in the opposite direction and then glided away. And then I heard him whistling, and that was when Mark rescued me. "That is the most incredible story I have ever heard in my entire life," said my mother, wiping tears from her eyes and blowing her nose loudly in her handkerchief. "Don't mind me," she said. "I'm crying because I'm so happy. You sound like you were rescued by angels covered in hair. Who says that angels have to conform to the stereotypes of being white and covered with wings? You had an angelic experience. Of that I am sure." "I agree with you," said Matilda. "Those creatures were so beautiful, and especially the male, and his kind eyes I can never forget." I'm very glad to inform you that Matilda did not suffer any long-term complications or repercussions from her ordeal with her lightning strike. We believe the lightning remained in her feet and did not manage to travel through the rest of her body, but it was incredibly forceful to such an extent that it threw her off her feet with a powerful surge of electricity that for the first month caused her moments of confusion, exhaustion and disorientation, which gradually subsided. On the subject of the mysterious white dog we found, we were to discover that an old lady who had recently died had owned Cloudy, who was only a year old, and had subsequently gone missing, and we adopted him forthwith, and he was one of the best dogs we have ever owned. The Blossom family became a very special part of our lives, and it would seem that Matilda and my mother became the very best of friends, whom would never have crossed paths if it hadn't been for that storm and the Bigfoot. It was through Lucas Blossom that I met my husband at a barbecue at his home, and we had 3 children who have long since flown the nest with families of their own. So in effect, none of us would ever have met each other without the storm interceding in our lives, so the hands of fate magically brought us together. I now know, all these years later, that the creatures that rescued Matilda were Bigfoots, and you have my word that this is a true story. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Agatha, and I'm from the Pacific Northwest. And if you're wondering why I'm called Agatha, it was because my mother was a huge fan of Agatha Christie's work, such as the famous detective Hercule Poirot, Miss Marple, and the quintessential world-famous story Murder on the Orient Express. My mother was addicted to all her books, which was why she chose to call me Agatha to honour her favourite author's memory. I'm not actually sure if she was hoping that I'd turn out to be an awe-inspiring sleuth myself, but if it helps, I do happen to have an inquiring mind and a natural inquisitive disposition, which counts for something, I suppose. I did, however, not happen to go missing for 11 long days, as was the mysterious case that surrounds Agatha Christie's life, that still all these years later, long after the author's death, is veiled and clouded in enigmatic circumstances that were indeed so strange and peculiar that they raised more questions than answers. And this incredulous, bizarre case was never ever unravelled or solved, but luckily she was found safe and well in a hotel in Harrogate. It would seem that Agatha Christie herself could not provide any clues as to what had happened to her. Could it be that the mysterious writer herself had surreptitiously drawn herself down a rabbit hole of mysterious intrigue that she could never resolve, as her memory may have been intentionally wiped from her mind. One can only ponder as to the answer to this curious conundrum or question. I was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest in the early 80s, in an area of exquisite natural beauty, in what I would describe as your quintessential wooden ranch-style home that overlooked the exquisite mountains, undulating verdant countryside, along with a pretty charming creek and a backdrop of ponderosa pines and Douglas firs that made up a very pretty savanne on our land that stretched back for a considerable distance. We lived on about 60 acres of land, where we owned a few free-range chickens, along with an incredibly annoying rooster that would make the biggest cock-a-doodle-doo noises at the crack of dawn that would sometimes drive me completely potty. We also owned 2 French bulldogs called Gus and Louis that quite literally thought the sun shone out of my father's backside, possibly because my father manipulated and bribed them with delicious doggy treats and took them on lovely afternoon walks in the countryside. Our flat-faced adorable dogs did enjoy sleeping on the couch and snoring for a long part of the day, and when they had enough energy, they were natural comedians that brought a smile to our faces every day of our lives, and one could not help but love them to death. My incredulous, outlandish Bigfoot story begins when I was studying for my 12th grade midterm exams, and I was about 17 at the time. My parents and my brother Paul, along with our 2 French bulldogs, were going away for the weekend, and I decided I needed to stay at home because I had tons of swatting to do. You know what I'm like. I'd much rather be doing anything else in the world other than studying. Well, the place will be very quiet for you, my mother said, but then maybe that's exactly what you need. I watched my parents, along with our 2 bulldogs, and my brother driving away from the premises, down the long gravel driveway, and all of a sudden the house became incredibly quiet and very still. I made myself a cup of coffee, put on some calming background music, and began to study. It was now 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the telephone rang, and I could hear heavy breathing, and I quickly slammed down the phone in disgust and returned to my work. The phone rang 3 more times, and once again I could hear the low, guttural, heavy breathing down the end of the line, which became increasingly unsettling. I tried to think about whether someone had an axe to grind with me, or possibly one of my friends was playing a trick on me, or was just some lone loser trying to scare the living daylights out of me. I thought back to the most recent relationship that had ended 3 weeks prior. I had been introduced to this young man called Jed at a party and had been on several dates with him, but the relationship had fizzled out because we simply had nothing in common with each other, and when I told him it wasn't working out and that we should call it a day, he had reacted in a rather nonchalant way with an air of indifference and had just said, "Fine, if that's the way you want it." And his expression had been so dead and disinterested, I really didn't think he cared at all. I thought it was unlikely it would be him calling me like this, but then who else could it possibly be? I was befuddled and confused, and tried to reflect on whether anyone knew I was home alone for the weekend. But I'd only ever told Lacey, my best girlfriend, about it, and I doubt whether she had informed anyone else, but I decided to give her a call on the off chance she might just happen to have mentioned it to someone, that I would be home alone. "I've been receiving weird phone calls," I told her. "Someone keeps breathing heavily down the phone, and it's creeping me out. You never happened to tell anybody else that I was home alone this weekend, did you?" "Quite sure," said Lacey. "I don't think I mentioned it to anyone. You're probably just receiving a random call from a perfect stranger who's somehow getting his kicks out of scaring you half to death. What a complete jerk. Or, of course, it could be some kids pulling a hoax on you. I wouldn't worry about it if I was you. Just don't answer the phone if it makes you feel any better." "You're probably right, Lacey," I said, deciding that I needed to return to my studies, and I gave the matter no further thought. Once again the phone began to ring and ring and ring, but I completely ignored it, and then it rang again and again, and with the rising level of trepidation and angst, I stood staring at the phone on the hall table, shaking like a leaf and feeling too scared to pick up the receiver, and even my heartbeat began to increase in intensity as I began to feel increasingly apprehensive. And then in a spontaneous moment of boldness, I quickly put my hand on the receiver and lifted the phone nervously to my ear. "Hello," I said, and there was a long, drawn-out, uncomfortable pause, and then I heard the heavy breathing again. My rising level of panic and trepidation was suppressed and overtaken by the smouldering anger that had ignited like a light to a cigarette. How dare someone try to scare me like this, I thought. "This isn't funny," I said. "If you think this is a joke, guess what? I'm not laughing." "I know you are home, alone," said this raspy voice that I didn't recognize. "Who is this? Who is this?" I asked. "Would you not like to know?" said the voice, and I could hear a low, guttural laugh. "Well, for your information, I just happen not to be alone," I said. "My parents are at home." "You and I know that is not true," came an ominous chuckle. "Go away," I screamed, slamming down the receiver violently, as if it was about to lash out and bite me, and eyeing it with a renewed sense of wariness, like a dangerous predator that I would sooner rather avoid. My phone had suddenly become as threatening and oppressive as a wild animal lurking ominously in the dark shadows, waiting to pounce on me. I just wish I knew what I was dealing with, as the not knowing who was at the other end of the line was the hardest thing of all. It could be a bunch of silly kids targeting me randomly and having a laugh at my expense, or it could be someone who knew me with nefarious intent. By this time I was shaking so much that it was very difficult to compose myself, and I seriously considered giving the sheriff a call, but I felt silly about phoning him over some erroneous fallacious prank call. As far as I was concerned, he might think I was overreacting, and I'd end up feeling like a silly little school kid who couldn't be taken seriously. The rest of the afternoon rolled along smoothly, sweeping seamlessly into the evening, and everything went by without a hitch, and the phone did not ring at all, except for one time when my mother was checking in on me. "Just wanted to let you know, darling, we've arrived safe and sound, and all is well. We settled into the delightful cabin here. It's awfully pretty, and Louis and Gus are having the time of their lives, and I sense the owner of the cabin has a soft spot for French bulldogs, and she gave them both a couple of sausages, but when she bent down, Louis grabbed both sausages from her hands, leaving nothing for Gus, and promptly scuttled away to eat them up. The woman began to laugh so much she was actually snorting. "That's so typical," I said, laughing. "Louis is so greedy, the little rascal. I do hope you made up for the shortfall. I'd hate poor Gus to lose out." "Of course I did, dear. You know me." "Are you sure you'll be all right, sweetheart?" said my mother. "Oh, I know I'm being overprotective, but I really don't like you being home alone. It unnerves me a little, even though I know you'll be safe." "I know, Mum," I said, "but don't worry about me. I'll be absolutely fine." After the telephone call, I went to the kitchen and made myself some melt-in-the-mouth toasted cheese under the grill and a cup of hot coffee, and returned to my study. It was very hard to concentrate. How was I going to remember all these dates in our American history and the sequence and order of historic events? It was like my mind was ablaze with a kaleidoscope of numbers and words, and before long it became clouded and fuzzy, and I realized that my concentration was waning and that I was just staring at my notes blankly, failing miserably at absorbing any more information. I know when my mind gets foggy like this, I have to call it quits, because there is a point when my brain shuts down, and it's futile trying to focus. I promptly went around the house double-checking the security, that every door was locked and all the windows were shut, and then I dressed in my pyjamas and made a mug of hot chocolate overloaded with marshmallows and a bowl of popcorn, and I watched a funny comedy on the television, which caused me much laughing, and then retired to bed. I had long since forgotten about the hair-raising airy phone calls earlier on in the afternoon, and I sank gratefully into my sheets, pulling my duvet over my head, and began to slip into a wonderful world of dreams. I woke with a start and groaned in frustration to hear the phone ringing in the hallway. I glanced briefly at the clock.
It was 12:10. I mean, who phones at this time of the night, I thought angrily, sensing in my gut that the nightmarish calls had begun all over again. Why would they not leave me alone, I thought, choosing to ignore the calls, but the phone just rang and rang and rang. I lay in my bed, my heart pounding and my anxiety levels rising, and I climbed out of the bed and surreptitiously crept silently to the hallway and stared at the phone as if it was as dangerous and inauspicious as a wild predator. I felt almost too afraid to answer it. Finally, I put my shaking hands onto the receiver while the phone just continued to ring. Eventually, in a moment of gallant, intrepid courage, I quickly picked up the receiver. "Hello," I said. "Who is this?" Once again, I heard the heavy, raspy breathing. "Who is this? Who is this?" I screamed down the phone. "I'm coming to get you," said the voice. I quickly put down the phone and ran to the kitchen to grab a knife, and then I looked out of every window in my house, but all I could see was the dusky sky with a scattering of stars, along with the full moon. And I went around the house, putting on all the outside lights so that I could feel more secure inside, but I couldn't see anything. All of a sudden, after about 10 minutes, I heard a loud clanging noise behind the kitchen door and nearly jumped out of my skin, but it was only a couple of raccoons ferreting through our outside bin. I sighed with relief and quickly retired to bed, reassuring myself that everything was absolutely fine. Moments later, I could hear the inauspicious sound of the gravel being crunched under car tyres, as someone was clearly driving down our long driveway in the middle of the night, and I could hear the vehicle grind to a sudden halt, possibly so that it could remain indistinguishable and invisible from the house. And seconds later, I heard the infelicious, ill-fated sound of a car door silently shut behind itself. I could hear pretentious footsteps, trying to be quiet, as they stealthily walked forwards down our gravelly driveway towards our house, and that was when I saw the dark figure, wearing a black and white Halloween mask, with the white drooping eyes and the round white open mouth, and in his arms he was carrying an axe. For a second I thought I must be dreaming. I even rubbed my eyes to make sure that I wasn't. I'd watched Halloween movies in the past, where heinous murderers had worn masks like this, but this was about as real as it gets. For a moment I was far too astonished and stunned by what I was seeing, but when the individual, whoever they were, began to start hacking down our front door with an axe, I knew instinctively that I was in serious danger and big trouble, and this odorous, diabolical individual clearly wanted me dead. I was in no mistake about that. I quickly grabbed the torch and hurried towards the kitchen door, and began running over the verdant, undulating green countryside towards the woods, as I knew this vast wooded expanse was clearly the safest place for me to take refuge, as there are many nooks and crannies and great places to hide. I began to run, with my heart pounding violently in my chest, and my adrenaline coursing through my veins, while I was breathing very rapidly. I realized that running behind me at a short distance was the masked man. I quickly entered the woods and began looking around frantically for somewhere to hide, and crawled under a thorn bush with jagged thorns that cut through my skin, piercing it viciously. But I didn't care and didn't even feel the fearsome jabs. But I assure you, in moments of elevated fear, you simply don't feel pain. Well, that was my experience anyway. I slid under the small gap in the bush, and thankfully my body was almost perfectly concealed by the thorny briars, and I had a great vantage point, as lying flat on my stomach I could see exactly what was going on. I knew that a thorn bush was about the safest place to hide. Then I saw him as he entered the woods, and he began thrashing the ground with his axe in a way that was designed to intimidate and terrorize me. "I know you're there," he screamed in a raspy voice. "I'm coming to get you, and I'm going to watch you die a slow and painful death, which is what a heartless, cold-blooded bitch like you deserve. Girls like you warrant throwing in a pool of hungry crocodiles." I could see the gruesome form of the man scanning everything with his torchlight, although in truth the moonlight on this dusky evening filtered through the trees, providing excellent visibility, which was rather unfortunate. I cannot recall a moment in my life that I'd been more afraid, for the menacing, malevolent energy this man exuded made me all too painfully aware that he most certainly wanted me dead. And whoever he was, he had a grievance against me, a crow to pluck, or an axe to grind, literally and figuratively. The man continued to search for me, and at one point he was so close to me that I could have almost touched him with stretching my hand beneath the bush, but I didn't. He seemed to have disregard for searching beneath the thorny briars. "You bitch," came the rasping voice. "I will not rest until you're dead." All of a sudden, out of the dark shadows, thundering through the thorny brush like a rhino in the thicket, a colossal, dark, shadowy silhouette of a huge beast appeared, that at first looked to me like a massive bear, standing upright on its haunches, towering at an impressive 9 feet off the ground. But this was no bear, for although the critter was covered in long, flowing dark hair, it possessed overlong arms and human-like hands and feet, and when its head swivelled in my direction like an owl's, it appeared to possess a strikingly human face with a sloping forehead and deep-set dark eyes that exhibited a rather menacing red eye-shine, although many of its facial features appeared to be obscured by the darkness. On seeing this extraordinary creature, it would seem that the masked man began to shake in his boots, while the critter let out the most terrifying roar that was so ear-piercing and thunderous that it almost caused the ground to shake beneath me like a mini-earthquake. Even lying under the thorn bush, I was frozen in terror, so much so that I was unable to move a single muscle. I became as solid as one of those waxwork statues at Madame Tussauds, and all I could feel was the rapid vibration of my heart pounding through my chest at an alarmingly fast rate, as it wasn't easy to watch this outlandish, peculiar creature, such as the likes that I have never seen before, unleash its wrath on the masked figure. The critter curled back its thin lips to expose its large white teeth, and although not jagged and sharp, they were still incredibly intimidating, and it got significantly worse when the critter let out the most blood-curdling growl that was so petrifying it felt like jolts of electricity surging through my body with a powerful zapping force. The masked man did not run away, which on retrospect would have been the wisest course of action for him to take, for indeed he may have escaped with his life, for who in their right mind considers challenging a critter at least 5 times heavier than they are? Instead, the masked man stood his ground and tried to lash out at the creature with the axe, but he looked like a silly kid trying to provocatively poke a crocodile with a stick. In a trice the critter's patience had worn very thin, and he lunged towards the man and grabbed his axe from him and threw it into the forest, where it somersaulted backwards while the blade landed precariously in the ground with a brute force. The critter then tore off the long black mask, and to my horror I saw Jed, the young man that I dated, standing there in front of the savage beast, and I could see he had wet his pants, and his eyes had grown as wide as saucers. The young man began begging for his life, as he seemed incapable of running away. He was possibly too incapacitated and frozen by fear. "Please don't hurt me," he begged. But his words fell on deaf ears, as the creature swung his body around in his arms like a Catherine wheel, and then lunged towards a jagged branch on a tree, and with one powerful thrust impaled his torso through it, and within seconds Jed's body lay limp over the branch, and his eyes glazed over like a dead fish, while his mouth remained open in a gasp. I could see that Jed's body was most certainly deceased, and he had lost the fight for life. I could hear the critter grunting in disgust, and then he pulled down an entire tree trunk close to Jed's body with effortless ease, and the noise was so unsettling as it was louder than a bullet, and then he glided away through the forest with a seamless grace. As you can imagine, I was too affrighted to move from my hiding place and lay there in an adrenalized state of suspended terror, almost hardly daring to breathe as I held my breath. I have feared that the beast would come back, but I'm glad that he never showed up again. Once the chorus of crickets and frogs had faded, and the dawn chorus had burst forth in the forest in a crescendo of pretty tweets and warbles, I still lay there, until finally the early morning sun filtered through the trees, dappling the forest in a subtle ethereal light. It was then that I finally wiggled out of the thorn bush, shredding my skin to pieces with more scrapes and cuts. I immediately went to retrieve Jed's axe, as I thought about how horrified his mortified parents would be if they discovered their own child had tried to kill me. It was bad enough to lose your child to an animal attack, only to have your son's memory completely contaminated and soured by the horrifying knowledge that he had attempted to murder someone, as I am in no doubt that he had intended to kill me. In short, I made up a fictitious story to the sheriff and told him that Jed was my boyfriend who had visited me, and we'd gone for a stroll in the woods together during the night, when Jed had subsequently been attacked by a bear, and I had hidden under a thorn bush, and then run away, and on seeing me, the bear had pursued me and tried to break down our front door. It was in the 80s, and I knew that telling the sheriff about the outlandish critter that we had encountered would be unlikely to seem believable. It would be on par with me saying, "Hi, Sheriff, by the way, I saw an abominable snowman kill Jed." I remember the sheriff saying to me that it was the strangest bear attack he'd ever seen, but he really wished that kids would be more sensible when venturing out into the woods at night, and taking a rifle with us might not have been a bad idea. A couple of weeks passed after that incident when my mother told me that I had a visitor, who I was soon to realise was Jed's mother. She asked my mother if she might have some words with me in private, and my mother had agreed, but had insisted upon making us a pot of tea and a large plate of chocolate brownies. "Be nice to her," my mother whispered. "The poor woman has suffered a grievous and tragic loss." The woman was petite and fragile, reminding me of a delicate china doll, and I watched her trembling with the teacup in her hand as she looked at me nervously through very discerning blue eyes. "I know what you told the police is not the truth," she said. "Please tell me what happened." "I'm not sure that's a good idea," I said kindly. "Sometimes the less you know, the better. I really don't want to open up any wounds for you." "Look," said the woman, "I'll be perfectly straight with you and tell you what I do know. After my son met you at the party, he was so dewy-eyed and completely smitten by you. In fact, he was so excited, he told me, 'Mum, I've met the girl I want to spend the rest of my life with. She's so beautiful.'" My eyes clouded over with tears. "Really? He said that to you? I don't understand. Personally, I didn't feel we had a connection at all. So I ended things with him. He didn't seem bothered at all. Actually, he was remarkably indifferent, and I remember thinking I'd done him a favour." Jed was a troubled soul, his mother told me. He's always been guarded about his feelings. He may have appeared aloof and indifferent with you, but he was only masking his incredible, desperate hurt. After you broke up with him, he changed dramatically and became belligerent, aggrieved, angry, and even violent. He came home and turned my entire house into a scrapyard and broke everything in sight, from all my chairs to china. I've never seen him so moody and incensed. I was scared he was going to do something really stupid. He did not try and kill you by any chance." I tried to avoid the woman's intense stare. "I knew it," she said. "He did, didn't he?" I nodded, tears pouring down my face like raindrops. "I'm sorry," I said. "I really didn't want to tell you." The woman took me into her arms and kissed my forehead. "I'm so glad you did. Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." "For what?" I asked. "For protecting Jed, by not telling the police the truth and dragging his name through the mud, which you could have done. You're a very generous and gracious spirit. Thank you so much. You have no idea what this means." All this happened a long time ago, and I now know that the creature I saw in the woods was a very angry, belligerent Bigfoot. I also happen to know now that Jed overheard my friend Lacey tell another girl at school that she envied me because I was home alone swatting while my parents were away, Hence he knew he would be able to scare me by phoning me all hours of the night and mask his voice by making it deep and raspy to avoid me from recognizing him. All these years later, Jed's mother and I are the closest of friends, which is really uncanny. We often meet up together for coffee, and we both have taken up art classes together and occasionally visit art galleries and speak to each other on a regular basis. I couldn't imagine not having her in my life. She's a remarkable woman. As for movies on television like Home Alone, you'll never ever catch me dead watching them, because my real life Home Alone drama, or adventure if you like, was one hell of a nightmare. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah and all your listeners, my name is Jolene and my Bigfoot encounter happened in the spring of 2009. I would like to start by saying that I never ever believed in Bigfoot or the hairy man or Sasquatch, and I would certainly never in my wildest dreams would have imagined that I would get to meet a creature that stepped out of cryptid zoology. I really thought stuff like that was delusional and all made up. I was to find out how wrong I was. At the time of my encounter, I lived in a beachfront home in Oregon, which is strategically located on a high elevated bank overlooking breathtaking whitewater views of the ocean and bay. Our Cape Cod style home is situated on half an acre of land that is lushly landscaped with a beautiful terrace and yard with ubiquitous trees dotted haphazardly all over the place, giving the property a really authentic, natural feel about it. I was 18 years old at the time and really took living in this idyllic location for granted because I got used to the taste of the fresh, salty sea air on my tongue and the panoramic, spectacular views that I would see every day. That all changed when my 22-year-old cousin Sophie came to stay at our home for a couple of weeks. Sophie came from New York and was well used to the life of a city slicker, so coming to a coastal retreat like our home was her idea of absolute paradise. When I showed Sophie around our home, all she could do was stare out at the ocean views in awe. I could tell she was so absorbed by the stunning vegetation, the long stretches of soft white beach sand that were literally yards away from our home. However, what I believed enamored Sophie the most was the sparkling views over the ocean underneath a pristine blue sky and the soft crashing sounds of the waves as they rolled rhythmically towards the shore. You do not know how lucky you are to wake up to this sensational view every day, she said. What I would give to live in a place like this. Do you know how lucky you really are? Sophie bubbled over with enthusiasm like an excitable puppy, and her rapturous delight over my amazing life was extremely infectious. Oh, she gushed, there is so much I want to do here. We must get up at the crack of dawn, just when the sun rises, and go for a long walk on the beach. When she said that, my heart sank. I began to feel a bit like the big, fat, elderly dog that lay in the corner sleeping all day, while Sophie was the excitable, enthusiastic puppy that wanted to experience absolutely everything that life had to offer her. I was beginning to think my cousin could become rather a handful for me on her holiday. I loved nothing better than to sleep in late until half the morning had already gone, but I could see Sophie would be pouncing on me early in the morning to go exploring, and that idea did not appeal to me. My family were delighted to see Sophie, and that night we all took her out to our favourite seafood restaurant, where we indulged in some of the local specialities which Sophie loved. The best seafood I've ever tasted, she said. It doesn't even taste fishy. My father laughed. If your fish tastes fishy, he said, then it's not fresh. I did not know that, she said. Is that true? It most certainly is, said my father. It was 4:30 in the morning, and I found myself being shaken by Sophie, who was eager to get me up as quickly as possible. I felt very annoyed. What time was this, I thought? Was my cousin completely bonkers? Was she stark raving mad? I closed my eyes very tightly and pretended to be fast asleep, and I even made a few snoring sounds to try and convince her that it was impossible to wake me up. Sophie did not give up. She was relentless. She shook me even more vigorously and pinched my arm so tightly that I let out a huge squeal. Ouch! Wake up, said Sophie. You'd be useless in New York. You are such a slouch. Now I was annoyed. Sophie, I said, looking at my cell, what time is this? It's still dark outside. Are you completely off your rocker? I want to go down to the beach and watch the sunrise, she said. You have the ocean every single day, but I don't. I just want to enjoy every minute while I'm here, and I want to share it with you. One day you'll thank me for it, she promised. When will that be? I asked sarcastically. When you're old and grey, and maybe you're frail, and you'll look back on your life and say, thank goodness I experienced those sunrises with Sophie. Now I can revisit that memory. All right, I said begrudgingly. I'm coming, but do not make a sound because my parents are fast asleep, and the last thing you want to do is wake up my grumpy father. I reluctantly got dressed and followed Sophie down the wooden steps of the large wooden deck that surrounded our home, that offered sensational all-round views of the magnificent ocean. This deck of ours was a favourite spot for my parents to entertain on, and we had enjoyed wonderful summers out here barbecuing meat over an open grill, all the while truly being able to appreciate the glorious views and the sound of the ocean waves, not to mention the amazing bird calls from the gulls gliding over the water with their long white wings. It was quite a breezy morning as we ventured out onto the beach. The white sand was cool on our bare feet. It was low tide, and so the sea had retreated further away from the beach, and we found ourselves walking on the wet, firm sand. It was still dark outside, but the outside lights from my house, including my torchlight, offered as much light as we needed. In the olden days, said Sophie, this was the time when smugglers would operate the deliveries of their stealth cargo from the sea to land. It must have been quite exciting operating all those secret missions under the guise of darkness. Just imagine. Sophie, I laughed, you do think about crazy things. Suddenly Sophie ran towards some footprints in the sand. I was stunned. Who was up and about so early, I wondered, as I observed the long trail of footprints that were clearly visible all down the beach. The footprints were absolutely enormous, and when I say enormous, I'm not exaggerating. I mean enormous. I would say they were 18 inches, and the person, like us, was clearly walking around barefoot, and only the angle of the toe on the foot looked strange. Otherwise, the feet were like ours, but much, much bigger. Look at these footprints, gushed Sophie with excitement, and look at the strides. They're huge. I kid you not when I say the person who has walked down the beach with these enormous feet must have been taking strides about 4.5 of our feet. You know how big you'd have to do that? Sophie and I looked at each other in horror. Who could this be, we wondered? Who has feet this big? Bigfoot, laughed Sophie. It's got to be a Bigfoot. Sophie, you get crazier by the minute, I laughed. Bigfoot does not exist. It's like that Loch Ness monster stuff in Ireland. In Scotland. It's a myth and a legend. I'm not sure that your dad would agree about that. What are you talking about, Sophie? I asked, looking bemused. Why don't you ask him, said Sophie. Let's just say your dad and my dad had an encounter with a Bigfoot once, but he never talks about it. Why not? I asked, feeling irritated that Sophie knew something that I didn't. Because of people like you that think Bigfoot is just a huge hoax. I never said that I was not open to having my mind changed, I argued. Well then, said Sophie excitedly, let's follow the footprints and see where they go. I grew hesitant. If Bigfoot is real, I said, what if he's dangerous? Don't be silly, laughed Sophie. We're not going to go up to him and say, hello there, Mr. Bigfoot. Hi, my name is Sandra. How do you do? Of course not. We will follow the steps and hide away so that he does not see us. But we want to see him. You know how many people would die to be in our shoes right now? I was not convinced anyone wanted to be in my shoes now, and I for one didn't want to be in them either. The idea of following these footprints gave me a huge sense of foreboding. I had never believed in Bigfoot before, but the idea of pursuing such a potentially unpredictable creature gave me the chills. If my father had seen a Bigfoot, then there had to be real. But why would he have not told me about his encounter? I wondered, why was there all this secrecy? I finally agreed with Sophie about following the fresh footprints in the sand, and that is what we did, and they seemed to just go on forever and ever, until finally they just seemed to stop, in the middle of nowhere. Just like that. It was extremely weird. Unless, of course, I said, pointing to the rocky outcrop, he leapt onto those rocks and walked along there. That seemed like the only reasonable explanation for the end of the footprints. We had walked quite a way. Let's turn around and go home, I said. I really think pursuing this Bigfoot fellow is a little over the top, don't you? Suddenly we heard whistling. Did you hear that, gasped Sophie, looking exciting. It has to be looking excited. It's got to be Bigfoot, and he's coming this way. Quickly, run, hide, do something. He's coming. In that moment of mayhem and panic, we lost control of all our senses and just flattened our bodies onto the ground behind a large 5-foot rock, hoping with all our hearts that this creature would not see us. I want to say that chasing after a Bigfoot is exciting until suddenly you are facing a potentially real-life encounter. Then the excitement does wear off. That is when fear can take on a new level. It was a huge turnaround for me. I had never believed in Bigfoot, and now I was feeling a senseless feeling of overwhelming anguish. We could hear the footprints slapping against the rocky stones, and the creature continued to whistle happily to himself. I kid you not, the creature sat on the flat stone slab only yards away from us. It was the most thrilling and terrifying moment of my life at the same time. We peered over the top of the rock we were hiding behind and saw the creature squatting on 2 legs, looking up at the sky and whistling to himself. The creature was watching the sun rise and appreciating the beauty of it all. He continued to whistle, and then we saw him smashing something with a stone. It was a large crab, which he broke into pieces and sucked out its contents. The creature, squatting on all fours, looked enormously big. From the back view, he was covered with fine hair. Even from the back, I could tell he was not a bear, because his hair was not as thick or dense as a bear's, and it was a sandy color. I could also see those long arms and big hands. You could tell those arms were much longer than a human's arms would be. Finally, after finishing his little snack, the creature grunted with pleasure, like the satisfied sound you might make after indulging in a yummy meal. It was a sound of sheer contentment. The creature then stretched out his long body on the rocky outcrop and fell into a deep sleep. We could hear his heavy breathing and a snoring sound that sounded like irregular snorts. It was a funny sound, and even I found it hard not to burst out laughing. Sophie started to giggle, and I reached out and slapped her. "Shh," I whispered. "What if he wakes up?" The creature curled into a fetal position and turned around to face us, with his eyes closed. The creature was in a deep sleep, and so quickly too, I thought. Boy, I wish I could get to sleep that fast. This was the moment I will never forget. Close up and personal to a creature that did not exist, according to the know-alls in our society, myself included. Now I was starting to doubt. Now I was staring at it without a doubt, and it was a revelation to me. Bigfoot was definitely real. The creature I was peeking at over the rock had a curved A-shaped head with a hairless, weathered face and deep furrows or ridges in the brow area. He had a tiny whiskey beard on his chin and a mole-like spot on his face. Just as I was peeking over at the Bigfoot, I noticed his nose twitched, as if he was smelling something, and then, with that, he suddenly opened his eyes, and he was looking down on my eyes that had been peering up at him. He rubbed his eyes for a moment, because I imagine he wasn't expecting to wake up, with two human pairs of eyes staring down at him. I truly think he was surprised and shocked to see us, and I really did not know how to react, but neither did he, because we really thought the Bigfoot was out for the count. He was clearly a deep sleeper, but a light one too. The Bigfoot was not aggressive at all. Surprised, yes. Angry or hostile, no. He also was not afraid of us at all, but he did not waste any time on jumping up from his sleeping position onto his legs. Standing up, he was at least 6 foot tall and 4 feet wide. He had large shoulders, big biceps, and virtually no neck. He glanced over at us one more time with his curious, inquisitive brown eyes. I did feel those eyes were expressing an interest in us, but he was not comfortable in hanging around humans, that was for sure. We watched the creature walking away and turning around one more time, and then he was gone down the end of the beach until he became a black dot in the distance. For a good 10 to 20 minutes, even Sophie just stood there staring in silent awe at this marvelous, wonderful, but formidable creature. Finally, I was the one to break the long silence. Did we really see that, I asked? Or am I about to wake up from an incredible dream only to discover that my cousin did not wake me up at the crack of dawn, and I did not just see Bigfoot? It was a Bigfoot, said Sophie. Was he not the most beautiful thing you have ever seen in your entire life? She gushed enthusiastically. I would not describe him as beautiful, I laughed. I would say that he was the most intriguing and fascinating creature that I have ever seen, but beautiful, I think not. A little pongy too, laughed Sophie. He smelt like wet dog and cheesy sneakers. When we returned home, my mother was surprised to see us. I thought you girls were fast asleep, she said. Come and sit down. I'm making blueberry pancakes with maple syrup. I hope you like that, she asked. Oh, I love that. We sat at the table eagerly and wolfed down the pancakes hungrily. My mother looked at us in astonishment. Anyone would think you had not eaten for a month, she laughed. That sea air has really revved up your appetites. I needed the sugar badly, laughed Sophie, after what we saw. What did you see? Asked my mother, smiling. A Bigfoot, said Sophie. We saw Bigfoot. At that moment, my father entered the room, and as he heard Sophie saying Bigfoot, I saw my father growing as white as a sheet, as if he'd just seen a ghost. My mother roared with laughter. Did you hear that, Niall? She hooted. They saw a Bigfoot. They saw a Bigfoot. My mother's laughter revealed that she thought we were joking. She was so dismissive about what we had told her, and not for a moment did she believe it. You saw a Bigfoot. She laughed. My father was not so amused. You said you saw a Bigfoot, said my father, growing alarmed. Whereabouts? He asked. Oh, he was on the beach, laughed Sophie. We followed him. He was a real cutie pie, wasn't he, Sandy? I looked at my father's face. He looked as if he was about to explode. Do not joke about stuff like this, he said angrily. Those things are highly volatile, unpredictable, and extremely dangerous. Oh, please, Niles, laughed my mother. You sound as if you sound like a know-all. You sound almost as if you believe that Bigfoot's real. They're just winding you up, Niles, that's all. He has seen one, said Sophie with her mouth full of pancake. She pointed her fork at my dad. Tell them about your Bigfoot encounter you had with my dad. My dad looked at Sophie in horror. My brother told you about that? No, he just said that you both saw Bigfoot once and it was terrifying. That's all he told me. Well, he was lying to you, said my dad adamantly. And with that he darted out of the door, and I followed him like a devoted little puppy dog. He had entered the bedroom and was rapidly dialing his cell phone and pacing up and down the bedroom with a look of extreme anguish on his face. I stood by the wall and listened with my ears flattened against the wall. Why was Dad in such a state about this Bigfoot? I had never seen him behave in such a peculiar, standoffish way, and he had been so defensive towards Sophie, calling his own brother a liar. What was he in such a state about, I wondered. So your daughter knows about our Bigfoot encounter, said my father on the phone. Did I not tell you to never ever tell anyone about it? You betrayed me, he continued. Well, even if you did not tell her about our Bigfoot experience, you told her enough, and she's asking all these questions and making stories about seeing a Bigfoot on the beach. You bet it freaked me out, he said. I told her you were lying, and you must tell her that it was all a wind-up and that you were just teasing her. We can never tell anyone about this, understand, said my father. And at that, he put down the receiver, looking extremely angry. I never got to hear what happened to my father with his brother, but I gathered enough information to know that my father had had a very traumatic Bigfoot experience, one that he would never ever reveal. Even a mention of the hairy man brought him out into a cold sweat. Sophie got a phone call from her dad telling her that he had lied about his Bigfoot encounter just to wind her up and tease her. But Sophie knew he was doing that to humour my dad. We both knew that. We decided to tell my dad that we had lied about the Bigfoot we had seen on the beach. I could see the huge relief wash over his face, and he said something like, "If Bigfoots were real, they sure would not hang around a sandy beach or an area like this." I do not know why my dad has sworn his brother to such secrecy about a Bigfoot encounter. Maybe he's afraid of the doubters and the skeptics. In truth, I am too, because one day I told a friend about my experience, and she keeled over with laughter and told me that I was a brilliant comic. So there you are. I'm not going to tell anyone about my encounter, and neither is Sophie. But why not in an anonymous letter? So whether you believe my account or not, that is my story. Sophie was right. When I'm old and grey, I will be grateful for my Bigfoot experience. And yes, he's as real as you and I. I hope you enjoyed my story. I just want to say that that was a really, really stunning story. And it does just prove how uncomfortable people are about talking about their Bigfoot encounters. And if you're one of those people out there, don't be afraid to get in touch and tell us your story, because your secret is safe with us. It's not going to be shared with anybody else, and you will remain anonymous. Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.